Get started, right? I think isn't it? It's 11. I think.
Yeah. Happy to dive straight in, Phil. Should we go? Just before we start, there's a bit of echo, Phil. I can hear myself. Thumbs up. We're good? Cool. I think most people here...
Give it. Yeah, let's get started, Rachel.
Brilliant. Okay, well, hello everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Rachel, Head of Global Accounts here at Qualification Check, and I'm joined by Phil, Head of Solutions. Today's session is part of our ongoing webinar series, which also sits alongside our new monthly fraud bulletin that we launched this year. So, and events like UCHE, which we hosted last month. If you're not currently signed up to receive the monthly bulletins and event invites, I'd recommend you do so. Just drop a comment in the chat and we'll make sure that you're added, and we'll remind you again at the end as well. I can see quite a few who've joined us today, which is great. So please do say hello in the chat and let us know if you've got any questions. We will try and leave time at the end for Q&A, but if you've got any questions as we go, we'll try and get those answered for you as well. In terms of an agenda, today we're going to cover the key fraud trends we're seeing across the sector, including a PG and UG breakdown, which will be new for a lot of you. We're then going to dig into fraud rates by programmes applied for, or the subject area, and where the risks appear to sit based on data we're seeing so far. And throughout the session, we'll touch on some practical steps you can take away to reduce the risk ahead of this intake. At the end, Phil's going to also cover a case study that will help bring to life some of the emerging techniques that we're seeing in practice and just how fraudsters are willing to go. Ultimately, the aim is to share the fraud patterns we're seeing, where the risks are changing, and what you can do now to prepare and reduce those risks. I do just really want to quickly cover, for anyone who doesn't know, an outline of how we get our data and what we're looking at before we start. So importantly, the data is based on verified versus not verified outcomes following our primary source verifications. It's based on the country of the qualification. All applicants in the process have provided their consent as we go through, and it's also important to note that the data reflects the detected fraud. Unfortunately, we can't statistically measure the fraud that never happens because fraudsters know that qualification check is in place. So our system's got a really good deterrent effect that we struggle to measure. Moving into some of the data, for anyone who missed it, I also just wanted to share a high-level snapshot of the last annual fraud report we shared, as it's important for the context coming into this year. At headline level, if we look at the data, the overall fraud percentage reduced slightly year on year. So if we look at 2025, it was 4.51, or 2024, sorry, and then it went down to 4.23 across all countries. Now that movement's modest, but the direction is really important because it does show that we're seeing that deterrent effect evolve across the sector, with universities increasingly putting in preventative controls, sharing intelligence, and making verifications more visible in a way that influences and deters that fraud behaviour. I've just seen a comment, but I think that's somebody struggling with LinkedIn. Also sharing the previous year on year. So if you look to the right, we've got the sort of country list. They show a 4% reduction in most countries, again, reinforcing the deterrent effect overall. But in terms of volume, it's important to note, we're seeing a lot more checks being put through our system. So the number of fraudsters we've caught has gone up, although the percentage fraud rate has come down. And where it gets really interesting is the split between UG and PG, and we can see a clear difference in detected fraud there. So UG was 6.65% compared with 2.39% at PG level. I'll come on to that in more detail shortly, but it's also a really important takeaway that the fraud picture currently looks quite different depending on the level of study, not just countries. This next slide, before we look at that level of study in more detail, we're going to take a quick look at the more recent data since our last webinar, say September through to February. Compared with the full September intake picture and fully appreciating that January is a smaller intake for most of you, this period is still really useful to look at, particularly for those of you that do recruit in January. If we compare this period year on year, the fraud rates are generally higher compared to the September intake period. And importantly, they're increasing across most countries. So we can see here, particularly with the likes of Bangladesh, Ghana and India, they've gone up fairly significantly. In this list, the only one that's come down is the US. Marginally, it's come down a little bit. Could be that more US applicants are applying for the September intake rather than January, it's most likely. So the question is why is this time a higher risk? Well, one reason is that the January intake is a much shorter recruitment cycle, deadlines are tighter, decisions need to be made more quickly, and that creates a better opportunity for those fraudsters looking to slip through the net. As we've seen before, when looking at global fraud trends, the risk always increases closer to deadlines, and that January intake is almost one big long deadline. The second factor is the profile of the applicants. So January intakes often include applicants who missed or were rejected in September. So they are reapplying quickly, which increases things like document manipulation. We see a lot of grade inflations, and we also see agents submitting documents where there's fraud happening and proper checks aren't being carried out. Finally, there's the operational pressure on you guys. So January intakes typically mean faster turnaround expectations and less time for internal verifications, which basically are exploited by those fraudsters. Been quite a bit of data on maps, but we just wanted to put that into like a nice picture for you guys, which kind of shows those key markets. Now, importantly, the others are greyed out, not because no fraud happens there, but they're just not in that list at the moment. But two countries that we did want to call out were Turkey and France. Turkey saw a 415% increase for the September and February year-on-year period. So moving from 1.22% to 6.28% between that time period. So quite big. France also saw a less high extreme with the growth. It was 48%, but that moved from 3.9% to 5.77%. So it started off higher and is quite a high fraud rate that we see in France. Now, if anyone does have any particular markets outside of those that they want to more data on, please do feel free to get in touch, and we can share that with you after this event. Moving on then, and looking at the PG versus UG, and what we can expect to see this year, it's useful to look back at the last 2 years so that we can look at those trends year on year. We're not just looking at the fraud rates overall, but when fraud is being detected and how that differs by the levels of study. But before we kind of dive into the numbers, I just wanted to kind of highlight the differences, because we know that UG and PG aren't treated in the same way on our platform currently. For many, PG is used more widely across whole markets as a preventative measure, whereas UG is often more risk-based. We're seeing university partners putting cases onto the system when there's already a suspicion on an applicant or group, and the university is looking to us to prove that fraud. And you can see from this sort of data that that's working well. So if we look at the 2024 intake first, the average UG rate was 5.79% compared to 3.41% at PG level. So straight away we can see that difference. For PG, the pattern remains fairly consistent month by month across the cycle, and UG is consistently higher. If we then look at the last intake, we see a similar overall pattern, but with some important changes. So PG fraud as a percentage has reduced slightly, while UG fraud has increased. And that reinforces that kind of reduction in the PG fraud over time, that when verification becomes visible and consistent, we start to see that behaviour amongst the fraudsters. With the UG, again, in 2025, it was higher consistently. We had some quite big spikes when there were cases brought to us where there were suspicions, and we were able to prove that fraud. And I guess on a final point for this slide, was the spike. September does typically show a higher rate, which is normal in terms of that fraud is not random, it's strongly linked to the pressure points in the admission cycle. So the fraudsters are coming for you when they know that you're at your busiest. So I guess a couple of key takeaways from this slide is that fraud is risk driven by level of study, time in the cycle, and visibility of a robust verification process. Moving on, we just wanted to put a spotlight on India to show how fraud risk differs within the same country. This is partly because we know more and more of you using our platform to verify UG applicants in India for a range of reasons, including the challenges around verifying India Standard 12. As a result, we're seeing some specific UG fraud patterns emerging in India, mainly centered around those Standard 12 results. So we're typically seeing grade inflation, alter mark sheets, or reissued certificates. It is very results-driven fraud and hard to detect by document review alone. And Phil's actually going to cover a case study to do with India and UG coming up, so watch this space. I've rattled through it actually quite quickly, but we've had a quick look at how fraud rates varies by country, by time of year, and by the level of study. The next question we wanted to look at is whether fraud risk also varies by subject area. And I guess looking at this data set, the answer is yes, in short. Now, this is the newer data set for us. It's based on the programme applied for field from partners. So partners that are using our applicant submission model, we now capture the programme applied for by the applicant so that we can start to dive into this data and have a look at that behaviour. And if there's fraud rates, fraud patterns emerging by subjects. At the moment, what we're showing is high level, but as the data set grows over the course of this year, we'll be able to drill into this in much more detail over time. But even at this stage, we can already see that fraud risk does vary by subject area and it's not evenly spread. Looking at this, we're seeing fraud risk tends to follow three main things: our application volume and how competitive the subject is. So, for example, with the business and management here, we've got it at nearly 19%. It consistently has the highest fraud volume, which isn't surprising because it's the largest, the most internationally recruited subject area. The more competitive and high demand the course, the higher the fraud risk tends to be. And for more competitive subjects, we tend to see fraud due to things like the grade manipulation, because applicants are trying to meet very specific entry requirements. So it's likely that they're genuine students with a genuine study, genuine qualification, but they're manipulating those results in order to gain unfair advantage in getting into courses. Now, that is very high level. And again, if anybody would like any sort of better breakdown for subjects in your kind of key focus areas, please do let us know. But I guess, Phil, unless there's anything you want to add to any of what I've said, I will pass you over to talk about the case study.
Yeah, probably just on this bit here, I guess one of the things that we want to look at in more detail is maybe the countries, so where the applicants have studied and how that breaks down according to the different programs that they're applying for. That I know that's one thing that we've discussed internally, and there will be, I guess, more granular ways we can look at this data. But then that's something that we want to make sure that we're providing the right type of information for as well. So whatever's useful, obviously let us know, and then we can dive into that on our side and see what we can find.
Yep.
Yeah, so obviously Rachel mentioned it before, so it's the case study. I'm not just here to show off my new haircut, but the plan for this is obviously to take you through a case study that we identified recently, which is to do with the Indian Standard 12, the CISCE documentation that we'd seen come through recently. I guess just a bit of a backstory behind it. This was to do with a case, the best way of describing it is probably like a complex cluster of cases that we identified with one of our university partners, specifically to do with undergraduate applications coming from India, so the CISCE board. And the team, so our team that's based out in New Delhi at the moment, had identified some unusual, concerning patterns of fraud amongst that group of, or that cluster or group of applications that they'd seen come through, and they appeared to be coming from the same sub-agent network as well. So it raised some initial red flags on that side. And if you flick over to the next slide, Rachel, I think we touched on some of the key red flags that the team had then identified. So obviously, is the key thing that we've identified here as part of this webinar is linked to undergraduate applications, and more specifically the Indian Standard 12 documentation that we'd seen come through. And so we asked the team what were the red flags that they had identified, which ones had they raised, or had raised their suspicion and pointed in the direction of something that may be fraudulent. So when they did a deeper dive, they saw that some of the schools that were listed on the documentation weren't actually recognised by the CISCE. Same thing, that the schools also didn't appear to offer that study or offer study at, I guess, the Indian Standard 12 level either. So those two at the top level, just looking at the documentation itself, is what they'd identified. So when they pushed it down the, I guess, the standard verification route, they were also unable to authenticate it through the official routes that we use in order to authenticate or verify documentation. Same things that we do with degree level qualifications, and then also Indian Standard 12s, any diplomas, anything across the education spectrum. So those top three, obviously massive red flags for the team, especially if we can't verify it using the official routes that we typically do. And then beyond that, there were also concerns with some of the QR code behavior as well that was on the documentation provided. So all of that together led the team down the path of doing a more robust investigation in terms of the documentation and the cluster of applicants that we'd seen come through. And so on the next slide is where it should be talking about what we actually did then as part of both the service delivery team and the research team as well, because they would work closely together on these. So having the knowledge that this was a group of applicants that potentially came from the same sub-agent network and had all had CISC documentation as well, it did require further investigation and escalation of that as well. And typically when that happens, it means that we're triggering an in-person visit to the head office. Now, our team is based in New Delhi, which in this particular instance made it a little bit easier for us to go and visit them. I believe we're also setting up a team in a different office in another part of India as well, because that's also going to help us with all these in-person visits that we need to do, because some institutions still require that as part of the process. And also from our perspective, whenever we're doing more of these more in-depth or robust investigations, it helps us because we need to go in person and chat to the people that are involved in authenticating the documentation. So that physical visit then enabled us to confirm that those documents were indeed fraudulent, but that it didn't stop there, because we wanted to find out a little bit more about what was happening. Obviously, there were different red flags that the team had identified. So it became a broader issue to do with not just the documentation, but also the domain name of the domain name that was provided in terms of the verification itself. So there was a website impersonating CISCE that looked very close to the real one, and not just the domain or the URL that was fake, but also an individual that was falsely claiming to represent the awarding body as well. So it's two levels: it's staff impersonation as well as the website impersonation as well, which obviously continues to raise red flags. But it's useful for the team to understand exactly what level of fraud is then happening. So it helps us to avoid, look out for those really in the future and make sure that that doesn't happen again, or we're protecting our university partners. So the next step, in terms of what we've then highlighted is, well, beyond obviously what's there, is being able to then enhance our relationship with the CISCE as well. I mean, being able to sit down and raise some of these concerns. Sometimes it's not on their radar. Sometimes we need to obviously develop their understanding as well as our understanding of all the different types of fraud that may be occurring at the same time. But what it did identify for the team is that fraud is becoming increasingly sophisticated. I know something that Rachel, you've touched on in the past, and we have across QC, is we've moved beyond the days of just the standard grade embellishment tipexing on documentation. We're now looking at complete website URLs being created that would then impersonate the live or the real university website or board website, for instance, and that's difficult to look out for if you're not sure of the particular signs. It could be where the domain name resides from. If it's not from within that country, then that's a red flag right there. So then it's also pointing us towards looking out for the verification trails as well, and any coordinate applicant behaviour that may work alongside this too. And that's a key thing to note. So this particular instance didn't have that, but we've seen other instances where a university partner has received a notification from someone claiming to be at a university that a particular result shouldn't actually have been closed as fraudulent or not verified. And there were certain key metrics within that email in terms of what they were applying for at their institution in terms of the program applied for, that the university or the primary school shouldn't be aware of. And we believe in seeing those, and obviously having the audit trail behind us, that's peculiar applicant behaviour that's working with the fraudulent body at the front end of it to then try and manipulate the end result and support them getting into an institution. So any cases like that you do see come through, definitely point them towards us. At least as a first instance, we can understand whether this has come back from the official source or not. Beyond that is the physical visits, or the importance of the physical visits. We know obviously we're moving towards more and more of a digital age. Institutions are trying to enhance how they process verifications, but there are still remote parts within India that maybe have slightly slower processes in place, slightly more archaic processes in place, which still need a physical visit in order to then confirm the authenticity of the documentation that we see. So from that, we've got a few key takeaways as well, which is what Rachel had touched on a little bit throughout the webinar. From my perspective, is fraud. It's not specific. It's not specific to particular countries. It might be regions within particular countries as well, and there can be ulterior motives that we're seeing throughout. I know, Rachel, yours is probably more on the undergraduate side in terms of the key takeaways.
Yeah, I think on the countryside as well, it's kind of the countries that typically wouldn't normally be seen as high risk. So things like UK and US that we showed at the beginning, we're starting to see, although US did come slightly down for that September to February period, which could be because we'll see more in September. Typically they're not seen as high risk, and we are seeing increasing fraud there, but we think that's around kind of wanting to bypass English language requirements. They assume that if they've studied at an English language speaking institute, that they then won't do the additional checks. But yeah, UG is certainly hot on the radar this year, coming into this year, and we're seeing more requests coming through. And as I mentioned, the way in which partners are using the system at the moment is more to prove it rather than to prevent it. But we are seeing a shift in that behaviour, and long term we should have a more interesting outlook on the UG side. But definitely UG, don't ignore it, would be a key takeaway. Whether you do it, have more focus on it internally or through us, it's definitely one to watch.
And I'd add obviously the in-person visits as well, and the use of the sector knowledge for the two that are pointed on here. One, obviously, as it links back to the case study that I went through just previously. And I know it's not always feasible to do the in-person visits, but that's something where we'll be able to then support just in terms of the sector knowledge, and knowing that some of these institutions do require that as a process, and maybe here's what else you can do, or here's what else you can look out for that might support your final decision-making process when it comes to applicants, either from high-risk regions or beyond that as well, if you're looking into new markets. So that's our role here, is to then provide that to you on a regular basis around what to look out for in this sector. And I know, Rachel, as well, that you mentioned at the beginning around the fraud bulletin, and that's something that we're pushing more as well, to share that information.
Yeah, it's one of the things that we sort of are passionate about, sort of collaboration and insight. So the fraud bulletin is a way for us to kind of share with you on a monthly basis some of the key trends that we're seeing, and any kind of hot topic off the press things that we're seeing. That's shared via email on a monthly basis. So please do sign up to that in the links. But equally, we invite you to share intelligence in return that we can also kind of share. We are seeing that working collaboratively as a sector is really helping to drive down those fraud rates. What we don't want to be doing is sort of shifting the problem around to different different universities, if we all work together, it's much stronger. So yeah, sign up for that fraud bulletin, and we can also let you know if you're interested about forthcoming events as well. There's various roundtables and events that we will be holding that we can invite you to. Now, I'm not seeing much activity in comments or if there's any questions, but unless there's anything else, Phil, that you wanted to cover, we've got a few minutes for questions, haven't we?
I think we've got everything in there, so we'll probably put the link in for the fraud bulletin into the comments section. And then, yeah, if you've got any questions, then yeah, do feel free to reach out to us as well, and we'll get back to you. And even if it's just more data, we can share that as well.
Wonderful.